Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Ask Andrew. Every week, I answer some film-related questions that were submitted to me via the Ask Andrew page on the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org. If you have a film-related question, I hope you'll submit it, and maybe next week or in a future session, I will be answering yours. Okay, for today's first question, Ben asks, how important is film school? Many of my favorite directors, Quentin Tarantino, Edgar Wright, Wes Anderson, Steven Spielberg, didn't attend film school. But are these people just so exceptional that they didn't need film school? Can film be learned without film school? Can you even learn how to make good films, or is it something you've got to be born with? Well, there are a lot of questions here, and I think there are a number of considerations. Some of the people you mentioned, most particularly Steven Spielberg and to a lesser extent Quentin Tarantino, had advantages of being based in Southern California and having opportunities, particularly Spielberg, who is significantly older than the others, to break into an industry when the industry was in a different phase, when it worked differently. As a lot of people know, Spielberg basically snuck onto Universal a lot and began sort of directing television programs that were shot on the lot using a lot of studio players, and directors even were under contract for TV work and low budget film work like he started out doing. And the industry operated very differently, and that's really what gave him the access and his toehold to begin his career. Then he found a mentor there, and he was off to the races. Tarantino did what is probably the best individual route to becoming a director. If you can write a screenplay that a lot of people want, you can not sell it to them to produce until they agree to let you direct it. That was something that happened with Tarantino and Reservoir Dogs. He'd already sold True Romance, a screenplay he wrote. He didn't get to direct it. Tony Scott did. But he held on to Reservoir Dogs until he found a producer who was willing to let him direct it, and in exchange for getting the script, he also had the support of Harvey Keitel, who was willing to star in it, and that name and that backing made a difference. So it's really kind of a hard question to ask. Film school is important. It will teach technology, it will teach technique, it will teach perspective, it will teach aspects of how the industry works. It will give a young filmmaker a certain basis of knowledge, a certain amount of respectability and marketability within an industry to get an entry-level position. Like a lot of things now that weren't so heavily reliant on the academic credentials decades ago. I think of journalism, for example. People used to become journalists all the time without going to journalism school, and now people, there's a lot of stock put in a degree from a place like Medill at Northwestern or something like that. And the same is true with a filmmaking degree from one of the big schools in LA or New York, even though there are lots of other good places to go to film school at lots of other universities. But that's another question for another day. I do think you can learn things that will benefit you in film school. And my guess is that Steven Spielberg would say that if he didn't have the chance and the good fortune to learn on the job on the Universal lot, there are things he would have learned in film school as well. I think most filmmakers would acknowledge that they might have benefited from that. It's not the only way, and obviously it has its benefits and its drawbacks. But I do think that there are plenty of people who make livings as directors of commercials, television, low budget movies, whatever, who I would be willing to guess didn't always demonstrate some particular knack for filmmaking. That being said, just like art or photography or any other writing, any other creative endeavor, people tend to demonstrate certain knacks that would lead to an indication anyway, or suggest an indication that they would be successful. So I think you can learn a lot about being a filmmaker, and I think you can learn the things that would allow you to make a living in that field, if not as a director and then in some other facet of production. The thing is it's very, very tough. Obviously, there's a very low success rate. There's a very, very low success rate to reach the upper echelons of the industry. And I think most of those who do have some particular knack, either a visual knack or a storytelling knack or an ability to communicate with actors and audiences. And so I would say that if you had no particular knack and no particular drive for it, then it doesn't seem like something worth pursuing if your goal is to become sort of one of the most famous and powerful within the industry people. If you haven't demonstrated that, but you really have an interest and a drive, do I think that you could have a career after going to school that would allow you to be successful in a sort of reasonable sense, the way most of us are or aren't successful? Yes. The last thing I would say is that I think that it's not an absolute necessity. If you were able to get a job on a set or working for a film producer or for a director or someone else involved in the process, then you could probably learn a fair amount that way and perhaps work your way up without having gone to film school. I would say, though, that probably most of those jobs are taken by people who went to film school, but I don't know that for a fact. I've said a lot. I've sort of gone around and round a bit, but those are my thoughts on it, and I hope you found them useful towards at least answering your question. Thanks. For our next question, Max asks, how can The Graduate be considered representative of its era when it seems to occupy a completely different world than 1967? It came out only months after the Summer of Love, and Berkeley was full of politically active students and protesters, yet this is only mentioned once and never shown. Well, you raise an interesting question that sort of opens us up to a larger point about the way movies do or don't reflect historical moments. A lot of people would sort of say that you have made a point that rings true to them, that we have the second half of the 1960s, particularly in California, in our minds as having this view of hippies and protesters and the sorts of things you allude to, and you hardly see any of that or even have reference of that in a film that is from that era and thought to speak so well to that era as The Graduate. The problem is that those of us who didn't live through those times, and you're in that group, Max, and I'm in that group, tend to fall into the trap of learning about history or reading history or watching movies about certain eras and thinking that what we see or learn as being sort of unique or interesting or new for that time or formative or influential for that time was all that there was during that time. And I've been at the Institute long enough and have taught enough people in their 50s and 60s and 70s who were alive during that era and who perhaps saw The Graduate when it in fact came out, who don't take any issue with its depiction of the time, because not everybody during that time, not even every college student or teenager or college age person, was protesting or was participating in the Summer of Love. In fact, there's a good case to be made that it was a minority, a sizable minority, a vocal minority, and in some cases a powerful minority, but a minority nonetheless. And I think if you talk to a large sample of people who were in their teens or 20s in the late 1960s, you'll find that not all of them certainly were participating in the Summer of Love or protesting or things like that. And so to say that a film can't be emblematic of a time when certain things were happening, if it doesn't sort of embrace those things or fully depict those things, I don't think is an entirely fair criticism of that movie. And frankly, I think that I know in terms of my relatives that there were a number of them who saw the protests and saw the hippies and things like that, and thought that that was sort of not for them and wasn't something that they were interested in participating in at all, and actually found what the Dustin Hoffman character in The Graduate was going through and the things he was worrying about were much more in line with their experiences than, you know, whatever Abby Hoffman was doing, for example. So I think that the sort of short answer to your question, and all similar questions like this that come up about films that become identified with their historical moment, is that there are very few times in our history when something is everything. When some aspect of the culture or history has permeated everywhere to the same degree that it did in our sort of historical view of it, or in our cultural consciousness of that moment. I think a good example is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, if you saw that. Certainly, the film takes place in 1969. It's sort of split in the beginning part and then comes back at the end of the summer. In the beginning part, the Leonardo DiCaprio character has nothing good to say about sort of dirty hippies and doesn't understand the counterculture at all. And in a sense, he even feels that way sort of toward the end of the film. But by the end of the film, he comes back and he's got the long hair and the medallion and the different sorts of clothes that at the beginning of the film he was kind of, making fun of or speaking harshly about. And so, that look permeated the culture more than perhaps the worldview or the ideology or the other cultural changes that went with it did. If you'll recall, he's in his, he's got his long hair and his big sideburns. And when at the end of the film, when he goes out and he gives the members of the Manson family, who at that point he only thinks are just sort of, as he says, dirty hippies, a really, really hard time for being on a street. So the look of him may have changed, but his attitudes about the counterculture didn't. And I think it's important to realize that those attitudes were present in society in 1967, 68, 69, at least as much as the sort of movement of the Summer of Love and hippies that you reference. So I think that's a sort of way to think about a movie like The Graduate that explains how it can be emblematic of its moment to wide swaths of the population that was alive at that time. And a fair representation of it to those of us who weren't, even if it doesn't sort of capture the most, iconic or the most sort of, visually arresting elements of the culture at that time. Thanks. Our next question today comes from Alan. Alan asks, 1962's To Kill a Mockingbird remains one of the most beloved of all American films, yet, surprisingly, not all critics have been kind to the classic. Most notably, Roger Ebert only gives the film 2.5 stars in a 2001 review. He criticizes the film for its focus on, quote, the liberal pieties of a more innocent time, the early 1960s, and the way it goes very easy on the realities of small-town Alabama in the 1930s, end quote. How do you feel the film should be looked at today in light of the changing social fabric of America since 1962? Well, Alan, I think this raises a really big question, one that impacts the way movies are perceived in our culture and often leads to great controversy and great contention about certain movies. Namely, it has to do with the fact that movies, when they are made, and by and large, unless they are made by George Lucas, who embraces perhaps a bit too much updates to technology, movies are made at a particular time, and they are sort of locked in that time. And the contention comes about when people say that a movie that has a particular depiction of society or expresses particular views of aspects of culture or certain members of certain groups or cultures is no longer legitimate because those views have fallen out of favor, even though those views were the views held at the time the movie was made. We see this when there are... a really extreme example of this is the 1915 G.W. Griffith movie, A Birth of a Nation, which is a a very important movie in film history and also a very racist film. And it was even racist and recognized by many as racist when it was released in 1915. So, in some senses, perhaps it's not the best example because people can acknowledge it's a racist film, but it also has interesting historical import. But something like, say, Gone with the Wind, which is a movie made in the 1930s about the Civil War era and has a very sort of, you know, negative, limited, worthy of criticism depiction of the African American characters within it. Now, this is an interesting question in a couple of ways because it's made in the 1930s when views of race and the acceptable ways of depicting and talking about African Americans were very different than they are today. So it was made then, but it's about a time even earlier when those considerations were thought of even less, when African Americans were given even less respect in the broader culture or among many sections of white America than they were in the 1930s, which is less obviously than it is today as well. And so there are people who think Gone with the Wind shouldn't be shown, even though it sort of is set during the Civil War and everyone knows it was made back in the 30s. And so in that sense, it's kind of similar to Kill a Mockingbird, that it was made in the 1960s when views on race and the way African Americans were depicted in Hollywood movies had progressed some since the 1930s, but obviously not as far as they would progress and not as far as they have progressed. And that's a film about the 1930s when the views were even narrower than they were in the 60s and certainly than they are today. So there's a lot of different layers and a lot of different ways to think about these things. Your question, sort of at the end of your larger question, is about how film should be looked at, that film in particular, To Kill a Mockingbird, but I'll open it up, how film should be looked at in light of changing social fabric of America since 1962. And, you know, maybe it's my background as someone who's interested in history in general and looks at film history and finds that to be a particularly interesting area or way to study the medium. But I think that, you know, you're looking at a time capsule, a sort of moment in time of 1962, and the question I don't think is whether the film should be considered good or bad for its depictions, but what does it tell us about 1962? And I think that I'm a little surprised that Ebert took the tack he did in his review. He wasn't working as a film critic in 1962, so he didn't review the film when it was released. And as I said, this review that you excerpt is from 2001, which I think, you know, puts him in the position of having a lot more hindsight on the 1962 depiction of race in the South in the 1930s. My feeling would probably be that, or my sense is that in 1962, the depiction in the film wasn't that out of step with where much of white culture was, which, I mean, isn't an endorsement and isn't a very positive statement, but does, you know, tell us something about that, which is why I think this whole area is interesting. I think the better question kind of is, you know, what's the difference? Can a film depict problematic, you know, attitudes, behaviors, etc., and not be seen as endorsing them? I think that, you know, and I'm a little surprised that Ebert didn't have the sort of, you know, critical discipline to not look at the film from 2001, which is hard to do, I'll grant you, but he was one of the best in that work. So I think that my personal view is that, you know, more information, more discussion, more discourse is better. And to me, that translates to show these movies from times in the past when their depiction and even though their depictions are problematic, and let's have that be part of the discussion, part of the study of the history. And so, I also would say that in terms of To Kill a Mockingbird being beloved, it's obviously, at least I guess I should say, hopefully not beloved for its depiction of race. I think, and this is a criticism in and of itself, a lot of people sort of look past that issue, and maybe Ebert was frustrated by that. Perhaps he had done that himself in earlier viewings and was a bit guilty about it. I don't know. But maybe that's the biggest issue, that people look at this film as a story told by a child about her father. They look at it as a man who has things to lose and really not much to gain, standing up for something he believes in, even if he doesn't stand up in the way we would want him to or the way we would expect him to today. So, unfortunately, I don't think the movie is seen as being notable for its progressive depiction, and perhaps arguably even its accurate depiction of the time of the views of African Americans, views of white America on African Americans. But it's viewed and appreciated for other things. And whether those two things can both exist simultaneously is a bigger question for another day. Thanks. Our last question today comes from Marianne. Marianne asks, based on a New York Times recommendation, we watched A New Leaf, written and directed by Elaine May. It prompted me to do a little research about her career, and I read about her successes as a comedian, actor, and screenwriter. But she had less success in the directing arena. Do you have any thoughts about this? Is this the, quote, difficult woman syndrome, intolerance of behavior in a female director that would be acceptable for a male director? Or was she just not that talented as a director? Well, this is an interesting question, and I am not in any way an Elaine May expert, but I think I can speak more generally to some of the considerations at work here that might help people make an assessment of the career of Elaine May and other people like her. I should say that writing and directing are different skills. Some people possess all of those skills or both of those skills in equal or ample amounts. Billy Wilder's a great example. John Huston's a great example. But plenty of people don't. Plenty of people are wonderful, wonderful screenwriters. And maybe they had no interest in directing. Maybe that was because they had no aptitude, but for whatever reason, they never got to direct. There are plenty of terrific, outstanding directors that you typically don't see them writing the screenplays for the films they direct, and when they do, they're perhaps not as good as some of their other screenplays. I think this is the case for Martin Scorsese, for Steven Spielberg, and it was certainly the case for Alfred Hitchcock. I think if you look at Billy Wilder, you'll notice that throughout his career he had writing partners, and he worked on several films with each of those partners, and those partners were integral to this, the skill and the success and the unique qualities of those screenplays. But those people never went on to direct, really, and Wilder was able to do both and kept doing both. So I think we need to acknowledge that just because someone can write and can be a brilliant writer and a brilliant performer doesn't mean they're necessarily a good director. There are certain attributes that are required and certain headaches that come with it that maybe people, a given person doesn't have those aptitudes or isn't interested in those headaches. I think that the question with Elaine May comes up because she started her career working with Mike Nichols, and they were partners in comedy, and he went on and had this career. But if memory serves, he had his great successes as a director not with works that he wrote. I'm not saying he couldn't write and he wasn't a good storyteller in that way. He obviously was, but I don't think he wrote or was the primary writer for most of his movies, and certainly not the ones that we most identify him with as being tremendously successful in a critical sense. So I think I would say as a screenwriter, Elaine May had a much better career. And, that's in and of itself is something that should be recognized and applauded. In terms of why she didn't have a better career as a director, I think that, certainly some of it might have had to do with sexism, as you suggest in your question. I don't think it's necessarily fair to assume that all directors are as, demanding, bullying, obnoxious as you suggest, and that, when women are that way, it's not tolerated, but it is with men. I don't think that's necessarily fair to say. Not the gender disparity, but the fact that for a man to be a successful director, he has to be that way, or for anyone to be a successful director, they need to be that way. I don't know if that's necessarily the case, and I don't, recall hearing any stories of Mike Nichols being difficult to work with, though there certainly are directors who are known for that. I think part of the issue for Elaine May in particular might just sort of boil down to bad luck. She was the director, or at least for a time, the director of Ishtar, which is thought of as one of the, the biggest bombs in Hollywood history. I think she really sort of, set herself up for failure by accepting that project, frankly, because she was going to be directing in that film the two stars, Dustin Hoffman, who was notoriously difficult to work with as an actor, which is why him playing an actor who's notoriously difficult to work with in Tootsie was so funny and so well received. The other star of that movie, of course, was Warren Beatty, who was a producer, was a very demanding producer. He himself was a director of some note. He'd already made Reds by that point, and other films, and was very successful. And so that would have been a tall order, a sort of hard pair to direct, to wrangle, to lead under any circumstances. And I think Elaine May, who was not the most experienced director, probably had a harder time doing it than some other people would. And one might wonder if, in fact, she was able to get the job directing the film because other people didn't want it because they knew how tough it would be, and she thought she could, she got along with those people with Beatty and Hoffman in other ways, and that would translate. I don't know enough about the specifics of the making of the film to say which of those options it was, but I think that, those sorts of things, the decisions that people make, the projects they take on, impact their career down the line. And you see people have setbacks, and sometimes they can recover from them, and sometimes they can't. And I think it's really interesting that, so much of the success or failure in show business in particular, but in a lot of endeavors, doesn't necessarily or only have to do with how well something is executed, but what one chooses to take on, what one chooses to do when they're in a position to choose their projects. So I think those are some of the factors that could have impacted Elaine May. As I say, I think she's a very interesting figure in the history of sort of, New Hollywood, and certainly an extremely talented screenwriter, and a very funny person. And the fact that she didn't have greater success as a director is an interesting sort of footnote to her career, but one that I don't think diminishes her accomplishments in a number of other areas. But I'm glad to have been presented with this question to think about her career some more, and maybe I'll go back and do a little more research into it to sort of satisfy my own curiosity that you've kind of inspired. Well, that's it for this session of Ask Andrew. Thanks to all the people who submitted questions. Please keep them coming. And if you've never submitted a question, but like these videos, please think about sending one in if it's on a film-related topic. Don't worry, I'm not going to embarrass anybody if it's a question, at least of all myself, if it's a question I can't answer, or a question that sort of, somehow doesn't make sense or whatever. Don't worry, I'm not interested in embarrassing anybody. Just send them in and we'll see what happens. But in any case, thanks for watching. Please visit brynmarfilm.org. Check out Theater 5, where we have a lot of digital and online offerings in terms of films and other things. The Film Studies Online page, where we have a lot of film education things on offer. And if you like what we're doing at Bryn Mawr Film Institute during this time that we required to be closed, please consider making a donation. Thanks very much, and I'll see you next time.